I was once taking part in a public dialogue on the question of God's existence, and during the Q&A time, a member of the audience put it to me, if an all-powerful God is really there, why do you need to be here defending him? The thought, I take it, was that if God really existed, he would be more than capable of making it plain to everyone that he exists. There wouldn't be any need for Christians to try to articulate arguments for the existence of God or for the reliability of the Bible. God would take care of that himself. The Cambridge philosopher and well-known atheist of the early 20th century, Bertrand Russell, had a similar thought. He was once posed the question, what if he died and, to his great surprise, found himself at the pearly gates standing before God? What would he say to God? His answer was this: not enough evidence, God. You didn't give us enough evidence. Perhaps you can sympathize with his sentiment, or perhaps you think that it presupposes a dubious idea of how God would do things. It's not only the outspoken atheist Russell, though, who wonders about why God's presence isn't clearer, but also, more troublingly, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Mother Teresa devoted her life to serving the poor in the slums of Calcutta and was well known for her dedicated life of faith. But in her diaries, which have only been published since her death, we get a glimpse into the profound sense of darkness and absence that she wrestled with. She desperately wanted to experience God's presence, but her longing went unfulfilled. She writes, "My God, how painful is this unknown pain. It pains without ceasing. I'm told God loves me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul. What are you doing, my God, to one so small?" Why would God allow Mother Teresa, of all people, to be left in the dark? In the past 30 years, this question has been turned into a formidable philosophical argument by a Canadian philosopher called J.L. Schellenberg. The argument takes as its starting point some assumptions about the kind of evidence that a perfectly loving God would give to humans if he really existed, and compares that with the kind of evidence that we actually find in the world. So here's how the argument goes. Premise 1 says that if a loving God existed, he would provide enough evidence of his existence so as to make reasonable doubt impossible. Premise 2 says that in actual fact, reasonable doubt about God's existence is possible. Our world contains people who fail to believe in God through no fault of their own. This leads to the conclusion that no loving God exists. Premise 1 is supposed to be a conceptual claim. Schellenberg says that we can see it's true simply by reflecting on the concept of a perfectly loving being. A being like that, says Schellenberg, would at every moment want to extend the offer of relationship to anyone who isn't actively opposed to it. And that means that a perfectly loving being would make sure that there's sufficient evidence for everyone to believe in his existence. Premise 2 is an empirical claim. It's a claim about the way that our world actually is, and it's one that Schellenberg thinks we should all recognize as being very plausible. The thought is that there is at least one person in the history of the world, but probably many, many more, who's not blameworthy for not believing that God exists. All of this raises an important question. How much evidence would be required to put God's existence beyond reasonable doubt? How much evidence would be needed for it to be impossible for anyone to deny God's existence? The atheist chemistry professor Peter Atkins was posed the question of whether he could imagine any possible piece of evidence that would lead him to change his mind. And he ended up answering that he couldn't. Even if there was writing in the stars spelling out his name, Atkins would conclude that he must be going mad. Interestingly, some recent research in psychology has suggested that we're not always very good at predicting what evidence it would take to change our minds on a given question. Then there's the added difficulty that it's hard to tell exactly what's going on in our own minds. It's not always easy to discern what our own motivations and desires really are. For example, take my 15-year-old self. If you'd asked me back then whether I was open to a relationship with God, I would have said that I was, and I would have told you that I even prayed sometimes. But looking back now, I'm not sure I really was open to God. Rather, I was in effect treating God like a vending machine in the sky, but I wasn't open to having my character and my deep motivations challenged and changed. So what I'm suggesting is that it's quite hard to figure out whether the second premise of Schellenberg's argument is true. What about the first premise, which claims that if a loving God existed, he would provide enough evidence of his existence so as to make reasonable doubt impossible? How plausible is that claim? Let's turn now to consider two sorts of counter-arguments that have been brought against premise 1 by various philosophers. The first sort of counter-argument is an approach that's known as skeptical theism. This approach is somewhat misnamed. It's not skeptical about God's existence, but rather it's skeptical about our ability to figure out the possible reasons that a loving God could have for being hidden, or in other words, for allowing the evidence for his existence to be ambiguous to some extent. In a nutshell, skeptical theism says that we may not be able to work out what reasons a loving God would have for hiding, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any good reasons. So compare two situations. Firstly, imagine that you and a friend walk into a room and your friend declares that, "I can't see any dogs in this room, therefore there probably aren't any dogs in here." That seems like a fair line of reasoning. Secondly, imagine you and your friend walk into the same room, but this time your friend declares that, "I can't see any fleas in this room, therefore there probably aren't any fleas in here." That seems a lot less reasonable because the naked human eye isn't very good at detecting the presence of fleas. So your friend's inability to see any fleas doesn't make it reasonable to conclude that there aren't any. The skeptical theist wants to say that things are a lot like this second situation when it comes to our inability to figure out possible good reasons that a loving God might have for hiding. Given our limited cognitive abilities, we shouldn't be surprised if we aren't able to apprehend the good reasons that a loving God might well have. Sometimes proponents of skeptical theism use parent-child analogies to try to support their approach. Here might be such an analogy. During 1940, the major cities of Britain were being bombed from the air at night in what was known as the Blitz. Children in these cities were evacuated to the countryside to live with host families until it was safer to return to their own families. So imagine a particular 4-year-old boy being taken to the railway station by his mother, who puts him on the train and waves goodbye. He doesn't have any idea when or even if he'll see her again. The situation here is one in which, in actual fact, the mother has an excellent reason for sending her son away to the countryside for an indefinite amount of time. But from the child's perspective, with his very limited grasp on the sorts of reasons his mother might have for being apart from him, he can't understand how his mother can be doing this if she really loves him. Again, the skeptical theist position says that it's like this with humans and God. We shouldn't be surprised if we can't see any good reasons for God to be hidden. Let's turn to consider the other sort of counter-argument to premise 1 of Schellenberg's argument. This approach actually tries to identify some possible reasons a loving God might have for being hidden, or in other words, for allowing the evidence concerning his existence to be somewhat ambiguous. The name for this approach is Theodicy. A theodicy is an attempt to put forward a good reason that would justify a loving God in being hidden. And this parallels the discussion around the problem of evil, in which a theodicy is an attempt to put forward a good reason that would justify a loving God in permitting evil to occur. There are lots of possible reasons why God might be hidden that have been explored in the philosophical literature over the last 20 or so years. And many of those ideas go back much further in the history of philosophy. I'd like to highlight just 3 possible reasons. The first one is the idea that if God's existence were wholly obvious, we'd be a lot less free to make significant moral choices. To get a feel for the idea, think about a parent who is trying to encourage her children to be able to play well together without constant oversight. If she hovers over them all the time, then yes, there will be less scope for misbehavior and unfair play. But The children will have a lot less opportunities to grow in their ability to make wise choices for themselves than if she lets them figure it out for themselves without watching over them all of the time. Or take another example. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when university lectures and seminars had to be done online, many university lecturers noticed that students were much more inhibited in what they would be willing to share in group discussions if the session was being recorded. In general, and this is something that's been backed up by some studies in psychology, humans feel less at liberty to act in accordance with their true desires when we feel that we are being monitored. So, a number of philosophers, including Richard Swinburne and John Hick, have suggested that if God exists, he would have good reason to be hidden from us to some extent, in order to make possible significant moral freedom on our part. Put another way, the only way that the world can be a place in which we get to form our characters through making choices is if God's presence is veiled to some degree. Let's look at a second possible reason why a loving God might be hidden. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard told a parable about a king and a maiden, which illustrates an important point about the power imbalance that would exist between human beings and an all-powerful God. Kierkegaard asks us to imagine that there's a mighty king who rules over a great kingdom. This king is an absolute monarch. He has total power over his subjects. But imagine that this king falls in love with one of his subjects, a humble maiden. Now, the king knows that if he goes to the maiden in all his splendor and might and tries to win her heart, her response to him will almost certainly be conditioned by fear. It won't be a truly free response of love. And so what the king does is to come to the maiden in the guise of a peasant, so that his true power and might is not made manifest to her. Only that way is the maiden truly free to respond to him in love, without fear or coercion. The analogy is an imperfect one, in that presumably it isn't that God would literally disguise himself and come to us in the guise of someone else. But what God could do to mitigate the power imbalance between himself and us is to make his existence less obvious and therefore less overpowering. Here's a third possible reason why a loving God might be hidden, and it relates to the idea that exercising trust amidst uncertainty is a very valuable thing. One of the main ways in life that we get to show how much we care about someone or something is when we're willing to stake our well-being on that thing or person, despite there being some room for doubt. Let's make this a bit more concrete. I've been married for several years. When I asked my wife to marry me, I didn't know for certain that all would work out well and that we'd be a great match. I had a fair amount of evidence, but not enough to rule out any possibility of doubt. But I decided to stake my life on the assumption that we were a good match. Now, to be clear, this is not the idea that faith is a blind leap in the dark. There can be a fair bit of evidence, but the thought is just that we can show how serious we are about someone when we're willing to stake our lives on them despite the evidence falling short of giving us complete certainty. In a world where God's existence was so obvious that no one could possibly doubt his existence, no one would ever have to risk anything in order to dedicate their lives to following him. So, to step back for a minute, we've looked at the skeptical theist approach, which says that although we may not be able to figure out any good reasons why a loving God would be hidden, that doesn't mean that there aren't good reasons. And then we looked at the Theodicy approach, which actually tries to identify some possible reasons why a loving God might be hidden. We've looked at 3 possible reasons, but many more besides these have been put forward. These 3 are just a sampling. It's also important to emphasize that there isn't any need to pick just one out of those different reasons I've outlined. They could all be true. But here's another important point. Someone who is calling into question Schellenberg's argument doesn't have to choose either the skeptical theist approach or the Theodicy approach, as though it's a hard binary. The way I like to think of the situation is in terms of a spectrum, where at one extreme end of the spectrum is the view that we're totally and utterly in the dark as to why a loving God might be hidden. We can't think of any possible reasons. And at the other extreme end of the spectrum is the view that we can know precisely the reasons why a loving God would hide. Somewhere in the middle is the view that I would lean towards, which says that we can make out the faint outlines of possible reasons that a loving God might have for being hidden. The reasons we can think of go at least some of the way to explaining why a loving God would be hidden, but we shouldn't be surprised if those reasons aren't completely satisfying. When thinking about this topic of divine hiddenness, I find that it can sometimes be helpful to step back and try to think about the different possible ways that God could communicate his existence to human beings. As we think about the different possibilities, I suggest that we can begin to see that each possible way has its benefits and its downsides. One way for God to have communicated to humanity would be through blindingly obvious displays of power, such as writing in the stars or speaking in a booming audible voice that people right across the globe can hear. The benefits of this would be that it would leave very little room for doubt. The downside would be that God would overwhelm us. Our freedom to make moral choices would be significantly constrained, and our response to God's offer of relationship would very likely be rooted in fear rather than genuine love. Another way for God to communicate to humanity would be to give humans lots of religious experiences. Now, if these experiences were very powerful and convincing, then this option would have pretty much the same upsides and downsides as the first possibility. But if the religious experiences that God gave people were a bit subtler and thus a bit more open to interpretation, that would leave us more free in the various ways we've considered, but a lot fewer people would end up convinced, and it would be fairly easy to come up with naturalistic explanations for those experiences. Another way for God to communicate with us might be to give us a proof of his existence, in the sense of an argument that conclusively demonstrates that God exists. Now, of course, some philosophers over the centuries have claimed that we do in fact have just such a proof, or perhaps several. I won't get into trying to weigh up that claim here, but just supposing that God did choose to communicate to humans in this way, would it convince virtually everyone? I highly doubt it. As it happens, philosophers disagree about almost everything, and it's virtually impossible to find an argument for anything significant that all philosophers agree is a good argument. But the other thing to notice is that if God revealed himself primarily through giving us an argumentative proof of his existence, that would seem to show preference exclusively to the sorts of people who have the time and resources to sit around thinking about complicated philosophical arguments. The overall picture seems to be that the more blatant God's means of communication are, the more that it risks overwhelming us. The more subtle is the means of communication, the more our reaction to it is going to be a product of the peculiarities of each person's character traits, life experiences, and so on, which means that God can't guarantee that we'll react in the right way without overriding or reprogramming us. In closing, let's consider a fourth option, which is the one that the Christian tradition claims has actually happened. In this scenario, God doesn't provide overwhelming evidence for most people, but rather provides a backdrop of clues and pointers to his existence that are widely accessible to people in all times and places, but which are also subtle enough that people can ignore them if they so choose. Then, out of that backdrop, God reveals his character in a definitive way by stepping into history in the form of a human being, but not a mighty king or a military general, instead a humble itinerant preacher in a backwater of the Roman Empire. Remember Kierkegaard's parable of the king and the maiden? Kierkegaard sees that there's an enormous power imbalance between humans and God. If there's to be the possibility of a genuine responsive love, there needs to be a way to overcome the power imbalance. And this, Kierkegaard suggests, is the solution. He says, in order for unity between God and humanity to be effected, God must become like us. He will appear, therefore, as the equal of the lowliest of persons. Therefore, God must suffer all things, endure all things, be tried in all things, hunger in the desert, thirst in his agonies, be forsaken in death. absolutely the equal of the lowliest of human beings.